So our topic today is confined space alert. Why is it an alert? Well, in the last little while, we've actually heard about some confined space near misses. Some situations where people had situations been a little different. People could have been severely injured. We do this training every year, whether it's in our regional tour that we do in December, or if it's maybe out at one of your facilities. We do this training quite a bit, and it's an area of concern for us. But we thought we should do an alert just to keep people's attention on this subject. This is a really important thing. If you're in public works type job and you die on the job, and there's a fair chance that a confined space or a trench is responsible for that. And so this is an area where I know Doug and myself, and Brent isn't with us today, but I know we care about this a lot. And this is one where we want to work to make sure everybody's awareness is high enough that they can be protected when they're out there. So you make the right choices. If things aren't 100% where you work, let's get them that way. That's the whole point behind this training. And I do want to point out, though, that this training is not the entire class. This is not the detail that's needed to become an authorized entrant for permit required confined space entry. However, we did want to raise everybody's awareness of this. We'll be doing the class, do it every year in December on a regional basis, and then we also do it on site for different members out there. If you've got a group that we can put together to do that, we're happy to do that training, or sign up for the regional training where we'll do it all over the state in December. All right. My goal with this is to increase your awareness of the hazards of confined spaces and to make a decision to improve your program. If you've got everything in place and you just need a couple of tweaks, that's great. If you've got nothing in place, you've got some work to do, but we want a commitment from you to do the right thing, because at the end of the day, this comes down to life or death. This is serious business. So while this webinar is not the entire class, it should be used as a direction. This is how this is the direction I need to go to make my program better and to keep people safe. And also, hopefully, it maybe spurs some conversation in your organization, as well as call us. We're here to help. If you've got concerns about your program, concerns about your equipment, we'd love to hear about it, and we'd love to help in any way that we can. So to start out, I think this is one important concept, and that's that any confined space can kill you. Any confined space can be dangerous. Even a concrete box, a simple vault, can have a low oxygen state, can have another hazard that could contribute to your death. And if we go into confined space entry with that thought in mind, that this space, no matter how innocuous it may seem, could kill me, then hopefully we'll make the right decisions when it comes to what do I have to do before I get into this space. Interesting. Every year we have fatalities across the country in confined spaces, and just a couple of statistics that always catch my attention. Rescuers make up 60% of the confined space fatalities. More than half of the people that die in confined spaces are rescuers. I'm here to tell you that these are not firefighters coming out to rescue people. Some of them may be, but the vast majority are coworkers standing outside of a vault or standing outside of a tank, and they look in and see their coworker tip over, and they say, "I've got to go and save this person." They enter the space and succumb to the same hazard that got their coworker. It's good to have a desire to help other people. It's bad to go into a confined space unprotected and without the things that we need and to keep us safe in those spaces. So a couple other statistics that we look at. 65% of all confined space fatalities are due to a hazardous atmosphere. And what that tells me is that we're not doing those really simple things that can protect us and protect our life going into confined space. Those two simple things are, one, testing the air, and two, ventilating the space. Really simple tasks that will save our lives. I guarantee that it will. 65% of confined space fatalities are due to a hazardous atmosphere. We're not doing our job when it comes to that in general. And I know a lot of you are doing a great job with this, but in general, we're messing it up from time to time throughout the year. A third of all the confined space deaths were supervisors. Just because you moved up the food chain a little bit doesn't necessarily mean that you're immune from this. And this last statistic is one that really catches my attention. 25% of spaces were toxic before entry. What does that mean? Well, that means that they didn't test. They didn't ventilate that space, and they went into a dangerous environment and tipped over. Now, I always like to look at statistics. I like to turn them on their head and say, well, what about the other side? Well, if 25% of the time these spaces were toxic before they went in, 75% of the time they were okay when we went in, and something changed. What is that something that can change? A lot of times it's what we do in the space. We start up a motor, we use a chemical, paint, or something like that, that we create an unsafe atmosphere, and we're our own worst enemy. We're our own undoing. So those are statistics that really catch my attention and should make all of us concerned if we're working in this confined space world. All right, so we talk about hazards. Our responsibility as an entrant is to be aware of the hazards that are present. Many of those hazards are invisible. You can't see carbon monoxide. You can't smell it. You can't taste it, but it's there, and it can overcome you if you're exposed to too high of a concentration for too long. Normal hazards are worse inside of confined spaces. So a simple slip hazard. There's a wet floor. There's a fall hazard. There's maybe electrical. They're more dangerous inside of a confined space because it's a confined area. If I'm down inside of a sewer manhole and I slip and fall and I break my leg, it's a lot bigger deal than if I slip and fall on the sidewalk outside of that confined space. So these hazards have to be evaluated prior to entry and consistently while we're in there. Not all spaces are created equal. You may say, yeah, we've got 1,000 sewer manholes out there, and we treat all of those exactly the same. We may miss some of those hazards. As I talk with many of you out there, you tell me about your spaces, and I ask, is there a confined space out there that scares you? Is there one that's consistently bad? You know there's always going to be hydrogen sulfide or a low oxygen state. And in most cases they report, oh yeah, there's that one space. So ask yourself, does the new guy, the guy that was hired last week, know that that's different? Have we looked at those spaces? Do we treat them appropriately for the hazards that are present? And always ask ourselves the question, is your life worth this task that you have to do? Well, I'm in a hurry. I just need to jump in there and turn a valve or check a meter or et cetera, et cetera. Is that task worth your life? We have the time, we have the resources to do this right and keep ourselves safe. If anybody tells you differently, I'd like to have a talk with them. Because that is simply negligent thinking. We can do this right, and if you need equipment can be purchased. There's plenty of opportunity to do this correctly, and the technology's in place. All right. So just think of common hazards. We think of confined space hazards really as being hazardous atmospheres and then physical hazards. Atmospheres could be not enough oxygen, too much oxygen, flammable environments. Maybe we're taking paint or paint thinner or maybe things like methane or hydrogen sulfide inside of a sewer manhole that could be flammable. It could blow up if we cause a spark to happen down in that manhole. Toxic atmospheres as well. I take a chemical in there that's toxic, maybe I could get away with that using the chemical outside, but when I'm in a confined space, it concentrates that gas or that material, and it could cause me to be overwhelmed. Physical hazards are things like falls, equipment, rotating equipment, electrical hazards. They are more hazardous inside a confined space because of our close proximity to those things. Okay, so our awareness of hazards is really essential. Every time before we go in, we need to ask ourselves, what are the hazards in this space, and what do I have to do to protect myself from those hazards? So here are some examples. These are examples that that OSHA came out with when they made a change to the confined space standard for construction a couple of years ago. And they said, let's throw out some examples because there are common questions relating to, is this a confined space or not? And we all pretty much understand that a manhole would be a confined space, a tank. But what about a crawl space? What about a duct in a large air handler for a building? Lift stations, silos, vaults, all of these things. How about an attic? Are those places confined spaces? Well, we have to ask ourselves the question: does it meet the definition of a confined space? And when I dive into this, I just want to point out that a confined space, we have compliance with OSHA standards, their permit required confined space standards, and then there's keeping yourself alive, keeping yourself healthy. Which one's more important? I think keeping yourself alive and healthy is the most important thing. Do we want to comply with OSHA standards? Yes, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to you keeping yourself alive and safe. So what's a confined space? It's space that's big enough to get into. I can't get into this cup, but I probably could climb into a 55-gallon drum. So that would meet the definition of large enough to get into. It has limited means of entry and egress. It's hard to get into. If I can open the door on a closet and walk into that closet, that really doesn't meet the definition. But if I have to crawl through a manway or a hatch, or I have to use a ladder or some other piece of equipment to get into that place, then it meets the definition. It's also not designed for continuous employee occupancy. So if your employer gives you a closet, puts a desk in it, and says this is your office, that is designed for continuous occupancy, and so it doesn't meet the definition of a confined space. But if you think of a vault or a manhole or a tank, we're not supposed to be in there for any amount of time. Okay, so that's the basic definition of a confined space. What does it take to be a permit-required space under the OSHA confined space standard? Well, what it takes is we have to put a hazard in there, or there has to be a hazard or a potential hazard. It says on here, a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. What does that mean, a potential? Wow, that could be a lot of different things. Well, this is a concrete vault, and there's some water in it. Well, can bacteria and other biological organisms grow there? Yeah. Do they consume oxygen? Yeah. I've got some metal in this space and it's corroding. Does that consume oxygen? The answer is yes. If we don't have adequate ventilation in there, it could consume enough oxygen that I could be overcome because I just wouldn't have enough oxygen to keep my brain cells firing if I climb down into that space. Other hazards besides hazardous atmospheres could be an engulfing material. What would a material that has potential to engulf be? It could be water, it could be sewage, it could be grain in a silo. This is one of the near misses that we recently heard about was some employees working in a vault when a water line broke and quickly filled that vault full of water. You have a large water line break, it can quickly fill up a vault that's 8 feet deep and maybe 8 by 8 feet. Just a small box fills up with water quickly. Is that a potential lethal hazard? Absolutely. So potential for engulfing an entrant, has an internal configuration that can trap or asphyxiate an entrance. So I've got pipes, or I've got a tapered down floor in a space where I could get trapped. Or here's OSHA's last thing they put on here: contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Maybe rotating parts, exposed electrical connections, fall hazards. Any of those would be considered a serious safety or health hazard. So that's where it could be a permit required space. Now, for compliance, once again, we're not going to go through all of the detail in this. We'll do that in December, or when we do the regional training. But this is the basic definition, and you have to handle this type of a space differently. Under OSHA, we have to have a competent person. And even if it's not under OSHA, we need to have somebody responsible for this entry into the space that knows what they're doing. And so a competent person needs to be able to identify the hazards of the space and be able to take appropriate action. They have the authority to stop the job if things are unsafe. We can't meet the requirements for entry. If we can't make it safe, we'll just stop the job. And that competent person's got to be able to do that. Competent person's also got to be able to bring in the appropriate equipment, have the authority to do the right thing when it comes to this entry. So ask yourself the question: who's the competent person when we do confined space entry? Are they competent enough to make the right decision? If it's you that falls into that category as competent person, how do you feel about your abilities, skills, and knowledge to be able to do this? Do you have the authority to go and get additional ventilation or specify certain things for this entry? If not, you need to ask some questions and work on your program. Let's see, let's skip that one. So what constitutes an entry? If I just reach my hand into this manhole and I can turn a valve, or I stick my head down in to see what's going on, is that an entry? And the answer is yes. Anytime any part of our body breaks the plane of the entry into the confined space, that's an entry under OSHA, and it puts us at potential risk. We've seen several situations where people have been overcome, not within the trust, but around the country, but where people have been overcome just standing outside of a manhole. As they popped the lid, there were gases that were released, and either they were toxic or displaced the oxygen, and people collapsed from those gases or lack of oxygen. All right. So before we dive in, before we enter a confined space, here's some steps. Number one, we need to be trained. Once again, this is just a simple taste of what we need to learn. In the full class, we'll go into detail on the hazards, what they are, how to identify those, how to use the equipment that we'll talk about here. But get trained. You need to be authorized by your employer to go in. If you're not authorized, don't go in. We need to have a plan, a written plan that tells us here are the steps that we follow to enter a confined space. We need to have the appropriate gear. It scares me to death every time we teach a class and somebody comes up at a break or after the class and says, hey, can you tell me about confined space meters? We don't have one. And they're currently entering confined spaces, and they don't have that simple piece of equipment that you've got to have to be able to make a safe entry. If you find yourself in that situation, let's talk. We want to help. We want to help you get the appropriate equipment in place and ensure your safety in entering these spaces. You know, this is don't feel, sometimes people are pretty sheepish about that. Hey, you know, we're not doing this right. You know what? Let's just open our mouth and let's work together. If it's communication or conversation you got to have at your operations, that's great. If you want to show people this webinar, that's important as well. But there are certain pieces of equipment like a gas detector, a meter, as well as ventilation equipment that are absolutely essential to do a safe confined space entry. In addition to that, some extrication gear, the tripod and harness and winch that goes along with that to safely get people out. We have to spend money? Yep, that's part of the cost of doing business and keeping people safe. And at the end of the day, we want to do it right. Make that commitment today that we're going to do this right every time, and we're not going to cut corners, because this is not a place to cut corners, because your life is on the line. Okay? We need to know our spaces. We should have a list of our confined spaces that identify all of those spaces. And you say, I got 1,000 manholes, sewer manholes out there. Do I need to have those on a list? And my answer is yes. There can be different hazards in one from another, and we need to have those on a list. Now, this is an OSHA requirement, but it's also important for us to be able to track those spaces so we avoid, we know what hazards we're getting into, and we can track what we've done in those spaces. We need to protect ourselves. So using a permit system is part of OSHA compliance, but what it does in the real overview is it ensures that we check all the boxes. We do everything to make that space safe before we go in, and we document those things. We need to know our roles, and like I said, this is a short presentation. We won't go through each of these, but you have various roles. You have an entry supervisor, an attendant. These are two essential positions that the supervisor is over the entire entry, and they have the authority to do the right thing, and they have the responsibility to ensure all of the steps are met. Oh, you're absolutely right, Debbie. She caught my, Doug, you're supposed to catch that. She caught my typo. It was really an early morning. Did you see the typo, Doug? He's shaking his head, no. I see it. I see it now, and I feel really sheepish about that.
Be prepared if something goes wrong.
What's that?
Be prepared is something goes wrong.
That one too. It was early this morning. Be prepared. No, that wasn't the one that she caught. I got two on one slide. That's terrible. I was thinking, I was hungry at the time. I think I made this because I wanted butter on my roll. It should be R-O-L-E. Thank you, Debbie. She caught me on it. It was early this morning. We want to make sure that our role is appropriate. All right, get back to where I was. I was talking about an entry supervisor. An attendant stays outside of the confined space at all times. They can't enter that space. They need to be responsible for monitoring the entrance, monitoring the atmosphere, and calling, notifying emergency services if something happens. If the atmosphere goes out of the acceptable limits, they need to notify the entrance and get them out as soon as they possibly can. What if you're an entrant? If your space, if your alarm goes off on your meter, that's an emergency, and your responsibility is to get out now. Don't hang around and tighten up the last couple of bolts. You need to get out now. If the attendant says get out, you need to do that. And so it's really essential that we have order in this system and that we follow those things. Always test the air. It's essential to do that, and ventilate your space. Those are two essential steps to making a space safe. What happens if something goes wrong? If something goes wrong, somebody tips over, your alarm goes off, or maybe a pipe breaks, or whatever it is, how do we respond to that? If we need to have help, somebody falls down and they break their leg, or they have a heart attack, how do we get them out? What type of emergency services are we going to use? If you're relying on the fire department needs to know that you are relying on them. If there happens to be a brush fire, a rangeland fire in your neighborhood, and your fire department's not working on that, you probably should not be doing a confined space entry that day, because you're not going to have adequate backup for rescue. We need to evaluate those emergency services as well and make sure that they're capable of doing the job. Many fire departments don't have the gear the training that's necessary to adequately respond to a confined space rescue. They may make an attempt at it, but they may not be adequately prepared. And those are those cases where we see fire departments occasionally having fatalities in confined spaces. Your meter is an essential lifeline to do this job. You need to know how to use that meter. You need to know what the numbers mean on that, and you also need to know that it is working correctly. How do we make sure it works correctly? We calibrate it. Who can calibrate that? Do we have to send it off to the shop? No, you can do your own calibration, but you need the equipment to do it, and you need to go through the owner's manual and walk through it so you're confident in doing that. You need to test it each time before you use it. Do a bump test. That means we hook it up to a cylinder of a gas with known concentrations and look at what it says on the meter. It should read exactly what it says on that calibration gas cylinder. If it doesn't, then we need to recalibrate it. That's called a bump test. If it reads the same as what it says on the cylinder, we're good to go. We can go and do that. Just document that you did a bump test and go do your entry. Know what your levels mean. What does if we read 18% oxygen on that meter? What does that mean? Does that mean I'm safe or not? The answer is you're not. If we're below 19.5% oxygen, that's oxygen deficient. If I'm above 23.5%, that's oxygen and enriched, and either situation can be dangerous. So we need to know what all of those numbers mean. Your meter only reads the 4 gases that it displays. Oxygen, lower explosive limit, and that means how close we are to a flammable atmosphere. And in general, it's going to be carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide, are 2 toxic gases, the most common ones that we deal with in industry and sewer manholes and various places like that. If I have a contaminant that is not one of those 4 gases, your meter's not going to tell you it's there. So if I have chlorine, I'm working around a water system and we use gas chlorine and it's leaking, it goes down to a low-lying area of this vault that I'm trying to go into. I can't rely on my meter to tell me that chlorine is there. I have to have a chlorine detector for that. So if you have questions about gas detection, please talk to me, and we'll happily walk you through and get you the appropriate meters, and get you in contact with the people that can provide those. Retrieval systems. If you're doing a permit required confined space entry, you need to have a harness on. You need to have a retrieval line tied to you. And if the space is 5 feet deep or deeper, then you need to have some sort of a mechanical system or winch to be able to pull that worker out should they be overcome in that space. And we can walk you through those as well, because there's a few different options. Rescue services, like I said, we need to evaluate that. Don't assume that your fire department is capable to do that. I've had some fairly large fire departments say, you know what, we don't do confined space rescue. We call in for county resources. How long does it take for the county to put together a confined space rescue? It's going to be, a lot longer than you can hold your breath. I'll tell you that. Maybe in the neighborhood of 20 minutes to a half hour. So if you're overcome, this becomes a body recovery and not necessarily a rescue. So let's evaluate that and ensure that we have adequate rescue services available. If not, we have to provide those. Okay, I went longer on this one than I did on the earlier riser. So if you want short training, sign up for the 7 o'clock session. This is an important subject. This is life and death. So just a couple of things to summarize. Know your spaces. Test the air. Ventilate. Calibrate. Calibrate your meters. Bump test. Ensure that everybody knows what their role is. Use a permit. Not just because it's an OSHA standard, but because that's the thing that will keep you on track to doing all of the right things. Evaluate emergency services, get the gear. If you don't have that, you need to have a talk with whoever's responsible for purchasing that today. Don't put it off. Do that today. All right, I think I wrapped that up. If you've got any questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll look at those. Debbie says Murphy's Law corollary is he was an optimist. Murphy was an optimist. Yeah, that's probably right, especially when it comes to me typing at about 3:30 in the morning on this. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong on my presentation. Just looking to see if we've got any other questions. Doug, you got anything to add?
Nope, that was great, Jason. And I would point out that, maybe you were talking about a different kind of role, like how you roll. Know how you roll. Make it okay.
That is how we roll. I'm thinking about butter and buttered rolls. That would be good. And you guys ever eaten at Maddox up in it's in Perry City, up by Brigham City? They have a great roll and raspberry jam. Don't forget that even equipment can be confined spaces. Heavy equipment and baling equipment. Yeah, Debbie makes a great point there. If you're crawling inside of a cardboard baler, that's a confined space just as much, and can definitely be a lethal situation as well. Ductwork, ventilation equipment, all of those can be confined spaces. So great point, Debbie. I appreciate that. All right, thank you very much, folks. I appreciate your attendance here today. Appreciate the work that you do out there. Let's do it safe, and we'll keep you. We want to see you again soon. All right. Remember, we'll be back at 10 o'clock, so in about 10 minutes we'll start up the next one so you can hear a little banter going in. And we're talking about, do we need a policy for that? All right. Everybody go out and have a safe day. You had a little chuckle there, Doug.